All right, one thing that's like a side thing, and it could even be like a back show that we could just kick off into like right away, real quick, is the personal issue of how in the hell do we keep being in these communities, keep being optimistic about reform and selling progress when we're constantly faced with a pessimistic reality and being flooded with the newest trauma and the newest problem of complete lack of advancement. Like even here in Baltimore, to sell what we're trying to do and to be effective communicators, we have to be optimistic, but at the same time there's almost no reason to be optimistic.
No, yeah. I think this is in some ways a philosophical question, right? The German philosopher Heidegger, who had some serious limitations, but whose philosophy today is used in, especially in continental philosophy, in European philosophy, really is sort of like the foundation of trying to break apart identity-based issues, is someone who talked about the ontology, the sort of structure of being of humans as one defined by care. The fact that we have concern for things, right? And that's not care about specific things, which is probably closer to the way we've traditionally defined the human being. The human being is rational, and rationality gives us truth, or it's the medium through which we know and understand and obtain truth. But truth is always like a very specific thing, like the Christian God and Jesus Christ, right? And so as long as you don't believe in that, then your rationality is defective. And if your rationality is defective and rationality is the defining principle of humanity, then your humanity is effective, right? That is effectively how we have written entire populations throughout our history out of the human definition. But by, I think, focusing on this idea that what makes us human is the fact that we just are concerned with things in our surrounding is maybe lets us not have the question of whether we should be optimistic, is just to accept optimism as a fundamental function of what we are as a creature.
So, so I have to go into this optimistic, ready to go, believing you're going to win, despite having all the data that says you're not.
But it's like, how many times have you or I tried to dunk in our life? I mean, I know when I was growing up, I tried to dunk. There was nothing to suggest I was ever going to get like the ball in my hand over that rim. But damn, have I fucking tried a million times. Why?
Yeah, I guess, the only thing you can say is that it is what you're saying, that it's human nature to continue to try and get this. And maybe we just we misguide our efforts, and the motivation can even remain pure when we do evil things because we're not extenuating humanity broad enough. And I think I do hit that wall a lot because it's easy to explain this happening to your kid, but to install policies and fight so that it doesn't happen to some kid that lives 2,000 miles away that doesn't look anything like you is the hurdle.
Yeah, it's funny because it makes me think of, I was talking to a friend of Freddie's, who was one of the persons who was really, I think at the forefront of the demonstrations. He's not one of the people who gets credit for being at the forefront of the demonstrations, but, those are the guys who actually knew Freddie, grew up with him, lived, the struggle of the streets with him. And we're definitely, among the actual leaders of the Gilmore Homes community during that period. And, I was talking about, with him and asking him about impact of losing a friend and how you sort of navigate that in a direction of like, I'm going to fight for this. And he had a very simple outlook, right? And this is someone who, grew up in Gilmore Homes. We know what the struggles are there. They are unbelievable. With all my years of education, I there's nothing I can say to someone in Gilmore Homes that I feel like is adequate to the challenge. I literally am left without a response. And he's like, look, I can't just sit around and mope about it. I got to get to work. And, for all of like my own moments of despair where it's like, oh, like my life is fucking terrible as I like sit here in like the 2-bedroom row house that I'm renting with like my cats and I'm, petting them and I'm sitting on my couch watching my big screen TV. It's like, oh, my life is miserable. I don't have $1 million. What the hell? It's like, to hear someone who is navigating a challenge that I can't really fathom. Like, I can understand it intellectually, like X% of people in this neighborhood will go to jail, whatever. I have no idea what that person is having to navigate from birth, right? Like from the youngest, most vulnerable age. And he's just like, look, what else am I going to do? I have to put my hand to the plow. I can't just like sit around. And maybe it's just as simple as that. Maybe there doesn't have to be a why, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there doesn't have to be. What you're talking, like, I think what you're saying about sitting there comfortably, that's a barrier to why we can't do reforms, is because the standard of living in America is so high that even if you're relatively not prosperous, compared to the rest of the world, you still have plenty of people to be like, whew, I got it pretty good just because I'm here. So that like lulls us from greatness. It allows us to be complacent. It reminds me of you talking about during the uprising how some people would go around shaking their head, or they say, how is this going to do anything? They talk about voting or all these issues and they go out. But it's, from my perspective, those are the people and mentalities that prevent me from helping other people. And it's often other people that look just like them and have grown up in those same struggles. But because we're complacent in what we do have, even though it's so small, that we don't really step up and fight. It takes somebody feeling like he did, that his best friend was ripped from him, and that these struggles were all in place. It's almost like recovering from drug addiction or something. And the idea that you have to hit rock bottom before you actually even get any fight in you. Like Tawanda Jones is the strongest fighter that I know, but objectively it had to come at her brother being beaten to death in the flow of the Black Lives Matter movement for that strength to optimistically go out towards seeing something. And how she continues to do that, I don't know, because a lot of other families of victims of police brutality just roll over and let it happen and accept it as a status of society. And then when we're trying to be optimistic and fight for them, it's like, oh, come on, like, I'm trying.
Yeah, I'm trying. But I suppose that just as an animal, we have always subsisted on the inspiration provided by others, right? Look, there are a lot of people who are never going to be, the demonstrator in the street, but they will be inspired by that demonstrator to go vote for a different type of candidate, right? To pursue a different type of public policy agenda. And maybe it's just one of these things that we have to accept. Like, there are going to be people who show the kind of extraordinary resilience that someone like Miss Tawanda Jones has shown, and other members of her family, because, they all participate in what is an years-long, ongoing, I wouldn't call it a protest, attempt to raise awareness about the lack of justice when especially poor African Americans are killed at the hands of police. And maybe it's enough to accept that, right? Like, we're not all going to be Michael Jordan, right? Somebody's got to be Steve Kerr, and somebody's got to be the guy in the stands cheering him on. And maybe that's enough.
I think you're like, I don't know. I kind of felt like you just hit on that. So, like, why be optimistic? Like, because it's Tawanda.
Or maybe it's not a question of whether we need to be optimistic. Are we an animal that is simply going to continue to pursue these things just because that's what we are? I mean, I kind of like, I remember, in our second episode.
But aren't we being beaten by our human instinct to pursue oppression?
No, but it's both. I mean, that's like, and so.
So are we locked into an eternal struggle of oppressor oppressed?
It's funny because part of this conversation touched on like the idea of humanism, and there are times when I feel like just the project of defining the human and the inevitable like boundaries it has created such incredible examples of oppression and violence and hatred. Maybe it's just worth abandoning altogether. But then the other side of that is like, That's fair, and certainly there's no question that these consequences that I'm describing are, have occurred as a result of this practice. But should we stop trying to hold ourselves to a higher ideal or standard? Like, are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater at that point? Is it an experiment that has just proved overall too flawed, or is it simply not an experiment we're actually engaged in? It is itself the experience of life.
One of the experiences of life is this thing I think we're starting to butt up against, which is that every younger generation is vastly superior to the generation before
one, yeah.
it. And every generation before it starts to have pessimism sleep into their ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And we're on the edge of our generations trying to be the leading edge of progressive thought and changes in the age of technology. So if this is our internal struggle and we can empirically say that each generation is better, we should have ultimate optimism in that future, because we have every reason to believe that those coming after us are much better, will take up the mantle and succeed, and we just might not be the ones that get any of the credit for it.
Yeah, and also, I think it's hard to deny that those of us who are alive today, regardless of what age you currently are, right, we're Moses at best. You might see the promised land, but then you're going to drop dead. You're never actually going to enter it. That's at this point, I think it's fair to say that's probably the best most of us who are alive today can hope for. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, yeah, the world is fucked up. Fucked up. There's all sorts of, you can point to things that if that doesn't strip you of your faith in humanity, like, I don't know what would. But that said, we have systems today that didn't exist in previous periods. Certainly, America is different today than it was at its founding. It's hardly perfect. We are nowhere near the promised land in that respect, but we can't deny that certain democratic principles, as they have been implemented in this society, have led to at least an ostensible commitment to the protection of minority rights, even if in implementation we are still far, 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 far from perfect. And that we have to not lose sight of the fact that while we are a very, in many ways, intelligent and creative animal, we are also a very stubborn and pathetic one. And so progress will always be slow. And we happen to get dropped off in this particular point in the timeline. And we just have to do what we can to try to keep moving the ball in the right direction.
Oh, you kind of got a little optimism put into me. Like right now, it's like I feel like my whole premise.
Did I solve this problem?
I don't know. Like my whole premise of this entire discussion came from I think some of my own biases, from a lack of perspective, and a friend of mine, whom I adore greatly, got us into this conversation and kind of had this spark this idea.
That's why you should never have friends, man.
in my own mind. But she's a millennial. Mm. And what I'm thinking is that, like, this question is something that I faced and keep butting up against. But is that the optimism? Like, she's the optimism, right? So I'm thinking, how do I navigate this space? And the answer to how I navigate this space is the source of the question.
Yeah, and I think we also have to be aware that, our particular intellectual inheritance tends to push us into a situation where we sort of like see ourselves as the center of the universe, right? Like we're almost always inevitably trapped just because of the way of that we think of ourselves, like just as individuals and as atomized units. We're almost always trapped in this sort of solipsism, which I think sometimes leads us to feel like optimism equals like coming up with the solution, right? And maybe that's part of the problem. Like what we're really saying is, I feel pessimistic because I haven't figured it out yet. But maybe that's a little bit egoist to think like I'm the one who's going to like solve it.
Or even more so, that I won't get the credit.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the attention or the reward for doing it. But that's the wrong measure of success, because if she's the one that does it, and I influenced some of that, and that was the ultimate outcome. If the outcome was my goal, then I have every reason to be optimistic in her.
You know, it's kind of like when you're a kid and like your friend does a backflip, right? And you're like, holy shit, that was incredible. There's not like, fuck your backflip. I could have done that. I could have done a backflip one day. Just got to it first. Like, you're right. Like, that doesn't enter our mind. We're just like, whoa, what just happened? You know, and it does seem like as we get older, we lose that. Suddenly it's like, if I didn't do it, you know, I can't, I'm not feeling it, man. My idea's more brilliant than yours. It's like, yo, chill the fuck out. Like, we're all engaged in a shared project. You know, everybody inspires everybody else. You know, we're all in this together. We're all carrying the stream. It's silly to say, like, that part of the wave hit the wall first.
Man, I think a little nuance just settled that issue.
That's been another episode of Nuance. Join us next week when
awesome
we
ending.
solve the rest of the world's problems in 5 minutes.
No, that was good, though. No, that's right.